welcome everybody to this webinar. This webinar is organized by EDRA along with Workplace Evolutionaries and EFMA. I will let Emily Dunn present and introduce herself and her organizations that she's representing. Today's webinar, it's organized by EDRA, as I said. Just a very quick reminder about our conference that is coming in May. The registration are still open, so please go on our website and check it, as it is a very timely topic this year, just environments. The webinar is open for AIA CEU, so the webinar itself will be available on our EDRA website in about a week. This is a free resource for everyone that is a member of EDRA. However, if you are not, you can become a new member of EDRA, of course, or just purchase a guest pass, and you will be available to have access to our resources. This link in red is the one where you can see and check out how to buy one. Before presenting our three panelists of today, I just want to pass the stage to Emily Dunn. Emily, please.
Thank you. Yeah, if you can move to the next slide. We at Workplace Evolutionaries are very excited to partner with organizations such as EDRA. I am EDX certified and EDRA member myself, and so really appreciate opportunities like this to partner with this organization. For those who don't know, Workplace Evolutionaries is an international community of strategists, chain managers, and facility managers, architects, and we welcome people from all industries across the globe to join us as we look at innovative ways to support the workplace experience and make sure that we are on the forefront. And of course, partnering with organizations such as EDRA from the research perspective is always a fantastic opportunity. So thank you very much. Really excited to see what the panel has to say today. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. It was a pleasure for us as well. Without further ado, I'm going to read the bios of these three exquisite gentlemen we have today. I'm going to read their bios, and then they will present their own work and research 10 minutes at a time. And finally, we will have time for questions at the end of the webinar. Please write your questions in the questions and answer tool that you can find at the bottom of this screen. Rex Miller, founder of mindSHIFT. Rex Miller is founder of mindSHIFT, a futures advisory and research firm. He is both a practitioner and consultant with 42 years of industry experience. Rex has written numerous books with practical approaches to using our environments to improve physical and mental well-being, performance, and culture. He has won the Cornet Global Innovator Award, Cornet's Industry Excellence Award, and IFMA's Award for Excellence. Rex is a business fellow at Texas A&M, a certified executive coach, keynote speaker, and a USPTA certified tennis professional. Some of his clients include Google, GoDaddy, Facebook, Intel, Amazon, Disney, Microsoft, and others. Mike O'Neill, he is Dr. Mike O'Neill. He is the CEO and founder of HumanSpace, a workplace analytics and IoT consulting firm with a mission to improve people's well-being. He is the author of 3 books on how to use workplace design to reduce stress and improve performance. Mike is a regular public speaker. He is a co-author of the ANSI National Ergonomic Workstation Standards, and his most recent 2018 book, The Healthy Workplace Lunch, was a finalist for the 2020 Cornet Global Innovation Award. Dr. Mike is also a pilot and holds a competition auto racing license, but his biggest pleasure comes from speaking to people like you about well-being. Charlie Grantham Charlie earned a PhD in sociology from the University of Maryland in 1980. Sorry. He has published 11 books, several dozen technical papers, and he is a go-to resource on workplace design issues, from psychology to public policy. He is a certified Master of Healing Arts and a credentialed Reiki Master teacher. He is a Vietnam combat veteran, having served 8 years in the US Army as a Chief Warrant Officer in the Intelligence Corps. That was followed by successful careers in academia and in Fortune 250 technology company as an executive director of research and development. He has now semi-retired and residence in Tucson, Arizona. Welcome, everybody. I'm very stunned by your profiles. So I'll let you start. Oh, I should have been here while I was reading. Mike, please.
Yes, thanks very much for the introductions for on all of our parts. It's really an honor to be here, being able to speak to both the EDRA and the We Evolutionaries communities. So, yeah, just want to give a kind of a brief overview of my thoughts on the future of the office. You know, there's a lot of talk out there. It's a very, very interesting time for everybody. Nobody knows exactly what the future will bring. But in the work that I've been doing, both the research and work with customers, to me, the role of office design in the future is going to have a couple of primary purposes. And one of them is, one thing that we've learned is that maybe to many people's surprise, is that actually a lot of work was able to be continued out of people's home offices. I mean, it wasn't easy. It took a while to get everyone sort of organized, but it didn't completely stop work. So that was kind of an interesting thing that happened as part of the pandemic. But it became pretty clear that the home office was certainly no place to build your social capital. It was, not a good place to network or to tap into your professional networks or to get knowledge capital from your organization. Great place to do heads down work, but a Zoom meeting is not a replacement for building a social network. And the other piece that I would say that the home office fails to really do is high performing teamwork. I think that many people would agree that high performing teamwork is still best done, at least largely in person, supplemented perhaps by electronic means, but probably is primarily best done largely in purpose. And finally, given everything that our population has been through in terms of our physical health and obviously our mental well-being, I would say that the role of office design is also especially going to be there to reinforce resilience and people's well-being. And when I say well-being, not just your physical health, obviously we need that, but your mental health, your emotional health as well, all as one package. It's very, very important in the future, a future role for the office. And, obviously that hasn't been so in the past. I think if you look at trends in the last 10 years or so, I think the trend was to pack people in as tightly as you could and make everything as open as possible. And it wasn't about well-being, it was about densification. And I think that the kind of the world of commercial real estate's been flipped on its inside out, and now people are at the center of this equation, and we need to support well-being. Could I have the next slide?
Okay. Can you see this next slide?
I do not see it, but I'll take your word for it.
Can everyone else see the next slide?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, it's just frozen on my screen then. Oh, now I got it.
Good.
So yeah, the future workplace is going to shift to meet people's needs in some ways maybe that have never been seen. And one of the points I would make is that if you think about your workplace, whether that's at home or at a Starbucks or at the office, you are working in a certain location to be able to access tangible and intangible resources. And those tangible resources could be a specific piece of software or technology or a specific type of room that you need to work in. That's a tangible resource. But intangible resources are things like people networks that you might need to tap, knowledge networks at work. Those are things you can't see, but they're incredibly valuable. The other thing that the workplace is going to need to do is to be a place where community gets built, and obviously highlight inclusiveness and that social capital. We need all the brain power we can get, and we need to make everybody feel included in their experience at the office. And finally, we're going to need to do some really hard work to figure out how to best integrate technology into spaces that can support hybrid or virtual face-to-face and group work. There's a lot of office spaces, good meeting spaces out there, but I think we're just scratching the surface in being able to truly integrate technology into meeting spaces that are going to let both face-to-face and virtual team members interact and share information very seamlessly. So these are all great challenges, but I think that that's what we're seeing. Next slide.
I'm done.
Okay, thank you. I think but in my work, I think absolutely the biggest challenge that we're gonna see is this hidden stress epidemic in the post-COVID workforce. So, thank goodness, I think we're seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, at least in the States, and in terms of the COVID itself, the disease, getting that under control. But right behind that, all the trauma from the stress experience, from this grand experiment that we've done, locking all of humanity down for a year. Let's see what happens. A lot of stress from loneliness, burnout. We all know the sad statistics of teenagers. This is not just something that we're going to walk away from and shed like a coat. Oh, okay, that's behind me now. Many millions of people will be bringing the PTSD-like stress of that experience into the rest of their lives for many, many years, and into the workplace. And it's an invisible thing. It's not obvious like a physical disease, but it's going to negatively impact people's performance and their retention at jobs and their home lives, and it'll have healthcare costs and things like that. And we also know that stress negatively impacts your immunity to disease, and that can't be a good thing. And we have new populations. I talked earlier about inclusion and bringing people together. So people that are neurodiverse or veterans, and Charlie, thank you for your service, and Generation Z are the most vulnerable to stress. They're already coming in with an elevated stress level. So this is something that we're going to need to deal with, but we have some ideas around that. If I can have the next slide.
Yes, here it is.
Okay. Just briefly, I got the slide in there just to make the point that, this whole idea of workforce compensation in healthcare is the single largest operating cost for organizations. And that's what makes it even more important to pay attention to the stress and the well-being of people, because that's the biggest part of any organization's cost. And then the next slide. So I see our biggest opportunity in terms of workplace design and thinking about workplace strategy and that overall experience is that how can we use the workplace design itself as a firewall against stress, against events that happen at work that are going to trigger stress in people. And so the things we're looking at is giving people more control over the features, their ergonomics of their features around their immediate workplace, but also in general, just the flexibility of the features within their overall workplace, and the ability, choice, and control over how to select the space they need. The other big design feature that we're working with is this idea of legible workplace. And legible workplace is spaces that communicate their intended use and that everybody can easily use and understand how to use them. And this includes groups like the neurodiverse and other groups that we're trying to be more inclusive at work. And finally, another element that we're working with are how can we create group spaces that help people get more resilient, that help them grow their social support and make them more resilient against stressful events. So it's all very fascinating and a huge opportunity to do things with the workplace to help reduce stress and protect the well-being of many millions of office workers. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Perfectly on time.
Awesome.
I pass the word, sorry. Next panelist should be Rex Miller, that he's here, right? Rex, everything all right? Can you hear? We cannot hear you. Let me. We cannot hear you, Rex, for some reason, but you are unmuted, so. Let me do this, and let me do. Can you unmute yourself now? Try to talk. No.
Charlie, if you're still on the call, you might need to disconnect so that Rex's microphone will work.
I'm not on Zoom. I just called in on my telephone. I'm not connected to the internet.
Right. That's why Rex's microphone won't work, because when we're trying to get Rex's to come on, it's going to your phone.
Okay, well, I'll hang up and I'll wait 10 minutes and then try to dial back in.
Okay, perfect. If you'll check your email, I've sent you a few emails.
I think he hung up.
Okay, looks like Rex is connecting to audio.
Right, yes. Okay, so you're muted, Rex. Can you unmute yourself again? Unless I have to.
Now, can you hear me now?
Perfectly.
Yes, perfect, thank you.
All right. The technology world, that is
That's
the
great.
weirdest. Yeah, that's the weirdest experience I had, that someone calling in would actually shut down my computer audio. But
you know what, that is an example of what Mike's was telling about, the stress of the workplace.
The stress in the
All
workplace.
these issues.
Poor Rex.
Yeah, I need a better stress barrier than
Okay.
that. Mike, can you help me with that? Okay,
can.
so building on what Mike was talking about, one of the contexts for us to get a hold of is that all of the stress we're feeling and all of the transition is through the filter of a mass disaster. This is a global mass disaster. Nobody in our generation has experienced anything like it. But having worked with experts like Dr. Jernigan in Southern California and his group called the Hidden Value Group, they specialize in war zones and natural disasters. And he shared with me this graph on the stages, the psychological stages we go through in mass disasters. So unlike a traditional change management effort, and by the way, this is the largest change management experiment in history that we're going through, it's very useful to understand stages and what we might anticipate going forward. So we've been through the pre-disaster side. We've gone through that heroic stage. And one of the unique features of this heroic stage is that unlike a typical natural disaster where it lasts a few days to a few weeks, this lasted months, which created what we know as stress fatigue. Stress fatigue can lead to burnout. It can also lead to what's called a level 2 trauma. And a level 2 trauma it doesn't look like we normally associate trauma, because we know what level 1 trauma is, experiencing something directly that causes you to be traumatized. And a level 3 trauma is something that teachers and caregivers know, that when their patient or student is in a traumatic situation, such as child abuse, the mirror neurons of that caregiver eventually begin to mirror that trauma in their brain. But level 2 is just extended depletion of resources, kind of that lack of hope, or that cloud that hangs over you. And over time, it does rewire the brain to have the same brain wiring as trauma. What that means is that there's this delayed effect. So as we begin to rebuild and look and anticipate going into and back to the office, what happens is that we look normal on the outside, but certain things can trigger an extreme fight or flight response. To give you some context for that, Prior to the pandemic, it was estimated that somewhere around 4% of the work population had some form of post-traumatic stress. Coming back, it could be as much as 30%, which is astounding when you think about it. But then what happens is that change is a stressor. So Dr. Mike was talking about being a barrier reef for stressors. We need to take that into account, not only in the facilities, but in the change management processes that we're going to be instituting as well. And then we can anticipate certain trigger events, annual events, certain kind of change efforts. So all of these are things for us to take consideration of. And it'll lead me into my next slide and looking at what Dr. Mike was talking about is that key to building resilience. So when the United States was involved in the Iraq war, what we started seeing is large percentages of soldiers coming back with post-traumatic stress disorder, and somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 18%. Dr. Seligman out of the University of Pennsylvania was giving a contract to study how we could better prepare people to be resilient going in. And what they found is a small percentage of individuals were coming back stronger. So I know I used the word resilience. Resilience basically means the ability to bounce back, but there's another word too, and it's called anti-fragile, and that is that the stressors actually make you stronger. So for my part of this presentation, I just want to give an overview of those 6 disciplines that they discovered and how you might turn them into some design criteria of looking through your facility through that lens. So we can move to the next slide. But more importantly, I'm going to dial into just one of those areas for all of us, because we're finding this is the easiest area for us to adopt and the one that will have the biggest impact on us. So the 6 disciplines are, first of all, resilient mindset. A resilient mindset, we can best look at maybe Stoic philosophy. And the first principle is that there are things you can control and things you can't control. And the mindset is to focus on what you can control. And those are typically internally to you. The second key principle is work with the hand you're dealt. In other words, make the best of what you've got. So that resilient mindset doesn't necessarily look for better outcomes, better circumstances. That kind of thinking gets people killed in the long run. They look for hope and the hope doesn't come, so they give up hope. That's the General Stockdale mindset that he talks about, what happened with prisoners in Vietnam that were always looking for that next date, that next piece of hope. So the hope comes from within. So the soldiers coming back saw that whatever the circumstances were, there was either a purpose behind it or it would make them stronger. Number 2 is activating your strengths. Now, we use the Clifton Strengths Assessment. We don't get paid for anybody who takes the assessment, but there's also the Seligman Character Strengths Assessment as well. But this gives you a little bit of an indicator of those things that you naturally do well and enjoy most. So if you were to just make a list of the things that you really get engaged and energized and kind of trace it back to what are those innate strengths that you have, that's a good indicator. When you play to those strengths, they are intrinsically rewarding, which means that they're releasing dopamine. And in a flow state, they release endorphins. That's called that runner's high or that endurance mode. A third piece is that circle of 5 or the community that you have, that's that support community. So again, think of each of these when you go into a facility. How can we help in our facilities improve and create that resilient mindset where people can work and play to their strengths, like through activity workplace design, where they have voice and choice, where they can build those social connections. Number 4, we call energy. And I'm going to focus primarily on the sleep part of it. And then purpose and meaning, if you're living for something bigger than you, beyond you, and every day you get a chance to do something for others, those are the 3 criteria that Viktor Frankl talks about as providing meaning. And meaning is vital to get through hard times. And then the next thing is, instead of measuring what we used to measure for outcomes, we look at progress, not perfection, leading indicators. So the acronym for this is RACE P2, resilient mindset, activating strengths, circle of 5, energy, purpose, and progress. So we can move to the next one. We can move to the next slide.
Yeah, I went. Do you see the next
Okay.
slide? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the other factors we need to keep in mind is we need to totally redesign the way we work from home in terms of schedules and breaks. This is an example of a 4-hour workshop that I gave to a firm, and I use Oura Ring and Whoop to measure the load. And in this 4 hours, I burned 4,500 calories walking. It's the equivalent of walking a 29.7 mile walk. So we've created what we call a work equivalency number of the number of hours you're behind the camera versus your total day. And you need to add an hour to each hour that you work based on working behind the camera. And that's a estimate, but it's a close approximation of the real strain that you're experiencing. We need to redesign work around that. So we can go to the next one now too. Thank you.
Here we go.
Great. So if you watched the Super Bowl, you saw that this old guy by the name of Tom Brady was the winning quarterback. They did an article on him about 4 years ago on his new secret to that resiliency and fountain of youth, and it's sleep. It's the amount of sleep and the quality of sleep. And this is the number one factor we're circling in on asking people, how good is your sleep? How much sleep are you getting? Are you hitting your key optimal windows of sleep? This is the best way to get that bounce back capability. And I'm going to recommend 2 books for you as you move along here. So we can go to the next slide. And I think it's the final slide.
Perfect.
So Matthew Walker's book, Why We Sleep, really set the norm. He's got a great TED Talk. It's a great book if you really want to get into the science of sleep. But if you're primarily looking for the tips and tricks for improving sleep, Sleep Smarter by Sean Stevenson is a great book. And if you have any other questions about how different sleep trackers can help you and which ones are the best, just either put it in the chat or send me a note and we'll be happy to help you. Okay, thank you, Renee.
Thank you, Rex. That was interesting. Next panelist is Charlie Grantham, and he is connected over the phone. Charlie, can you hear us? Can you unmute yourself?
How's that?
Perfect. We can hear you.
Okay.
Okay. I am right on your first slide.
Okay, so I obviously apologize to folks. I'm calling in by phone because my internet connection is not working well today. So are you on the home slide, says home workspaces and PTSD?
Yes.
Okay, let me give an intro. First of all, I want to thank both Mike and Rex for setting this up, and I'm going to do a deep dive on some of the things that Mike left off with about PTSD in the workplace. And I'm going to try to keep this brief and then open it up in the back end for questions. If you could go to the next slide that displays a pictograph of a brain.
The one with the words cloud?
Yeah.
Triggers?
No, it
okay.
says, yes, it's all in your head. There's a picture of a brain there.
Yes.
Okay, the first point I want to make here is PTSD in severe trauma is more than just an emotional or mental state change, that there's an associated physiological change that occurs in people that doesn't just go away. And this slide depicts 4 primary areas of the brain that are affected by severe trauma and stress. The prefrontal cortex, it kind of gives you dysfunctional thought processes and decision making, as you have inappropriate responses to situations. So if you're in a work meeting and all of a sudden somebody bursts into tears, that's what's going on. It has nothing to do with the immediate situation's reflection of something in the past. The hypothalamus really becomes overactive and leads to imbalances in hormone levels, specifically cortisol, which increases stress and anxiety. And I might add also, this gets to Rex's point about disruption of sleep patterns. When the hypothalamus is not functioning properly, your sleep rhythms and your sleep practices get thrown way off, which just exacerbates and accelerates stress effects. The big one here is the amygdala, I never pronounced that right, which is that little organ in your brain that sets off the fight or flight response, keyed to thoughts of previous dangers. People who are suffering from PTSD have an overactive fight and flight response. They're extremely hypersensitive to environmental stimuli I'm going to get to in a minute, but they're always on hair trigger. It never goes away. And that's really one of the biggest things that we need to deal with the environment. And lastly, the hippocampus, which stores memories, perhaps incorrectly. And what happens there is memories of traumatic events sometimes get keyed off by other stimuli that you wouldn't even think are related to it. Okay, so the point here is that it's not just psychological, but it's also physiological. The next slide, please, which should be called triggers.
Yes. Go ahead, please.
Now this is okay, thank you. Triggers are something that we need to be looking at as workplace designers and minimize them. But the big ones, and there's really 5. One I just alluded to, which is hypervigilance. People are always on alert, scanning the environment for real or even perceived threats. In severe cases, this can turn to paranoia. And that's not an unusual response, because we're overactivated, super vigilant, and people cannot turn that off. Secondly, people are easily startled. The slightest unusual noise or close presence of someone sets them off and gets snuck up. And if you can think of somebody sitting in a cube, looking at a computer, and their back is open, and somebody walks into the cube and up to them, and they don't sense that until the last minute, they're going to literally jump out of their skin. That's because they get startled like that. Also, we have people that have difficulty concentrating, which is related to hypervigilance. So much of your attentional energy is devoted to environmental scanning. There's little left for the task at hand. And again, this gets back to Rex's point. If you're in front of video and you're already stressed out and burning all of those calories in your brain, and you're also having difficulty concentrating, it just magnifies the stress events. Emotional triggers. These are usually seen as overreactions to other people's expression, and they set off, again, that fight, flight, freeze behavior kind of thing. And lastly, folks are also easily distracted, looking for any other shiny object behavior. And this affects all of their sensory things, which I'm going to get to in a second: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. We got to look at all of those sensory inputs. Next slide, please. Design solutions.
Yes.
Okay. What I've done here is briefly listed the psychological symptoms that I just went over and presented some suggested design implications or solutions. And I won't go too much in detail in the interest of time, but it really fits in what the previous 2 speakers have talked about, is making sure that folks are somewhere along the spectrum of PTSD, that you're giving them optional spaces to work in, and actually you're making sure that they have the choice of the space to pick that suits where they are in terms of their emotional state, the kinds of triggers that they're especially sensitive to. Lighting, acoustics become very important. And also the things that we probably overlook are workplace artifacts, pictures that may trigger events for somebody else that they've got in their cube or their workspace right next to yours, you have to be careful about that. It's not only what's just in front of that person, but what's off to the sides of them, and also what they may see walking down a hallway or going into a conference room or something like that. Movable work surfaces, people, again, it's about multiple places and giving people the choice to move in and out of those places depending on their felt state. And nobody knows it better than the person who's somewhere along that spectrum. So bright lights, bright colors, those are not things that you really want to do. Just to give you an example, bright reds and bright oranges set off some people because they're reminiscent of explosions if they happen to be a combat veteran. Or dark, dimly lighted places may be triggers that set off people that could have been sexually assaulted in a different situations. You really, as a designer, you've got to sit back and try to put yourself in that person's space about what are their triggers. Okay, the next slide basically is just a depiction of something that may be a totally neutral design space for somebody that has PTSD issues. I just offer that as an example to know that there are ways to do this. Okay, let's go to the last slide. It's all about balancing energy flows, which is a list of 3 references, resources you can reach out to and take a look at that dive down just a little bit deeper. And I will close right now before questions and go back to something that Mike mentioned. The numbers that I've seen most recently from the National Institute of Mental Health is that we can anticipate towards the end of 2021, with all of the responses to COVID-19, we can have as many as 90 million people in the United States who are somewhere along the PTSD spectrum. That's a lot of folks. And it's not going to go away. If we get to herd immunity and we don't have to wear masks all the time and we can go out and mingle with folks, that's going to be good. But these lingering effects of this disorder are going to remain. So we have to be constantly vigilant about them. And okay, I think my time's up. Over to you.
Thank you, Charlie. Very scaring, but interesting. We have time for questions. I'm gonna leave the slides, on the screen. So if you want to reference your slides while answering the question, that's fine. I'm going to see if there are questions from the audience. If you audience have some questions, please go ahead and put them in the question and answer box. I'm just gonna give a few seconds to see if there's something happen. Otherwise, I have a question for you. I think I'm gonna start then. I don't want to. In the meanwhile, please feel free to write your question in the questions and answer box. I'm going to ask you one question each, starting from Mike, who was the first one presenting. So Mike, since stress is such a hot topic, can you talk about all the research you are conducting in terms of how workplace can be used? And please tell me if you want me to go back to a certain slide.
Sure. Yeah, I can talk about that in general. Thank you. No, I don't need a specific slide. One of the things that we're looking into is how can we, so if to Charlie's point, at the end of this year, we're going to have 90 million people in the US on some sort of a PTSD spectrum. Okay, so we've got an awful lot of affected individuals. And he also, both him and Rex talked about how there are these things that can be accidental triggers to trigger a stress response. So one of the things I'm looking into is that my team is building a technology that would allow us to have sensors, either room sensors at work, or even have your phone listening to you, depending on how intrusive you want to be, that would do something called voice stress analysis. And so what I did was, in the last 6 months or so, I did a literature review looking at research that's been done on recording the sounds, the tonality of people's voices, and how that changes over time in terms of pitch and some other features, and being able to use that to predict a certain level of stress. But also, one of the things that happens if you're working on a task and you have a certain amount of stress, and when that stress raises above a certain threshold, you have to suddenly start taking resources away from completing the task and pull them over to tamp down your stress. So it immediately harms your cognitive performance. So wouldn't it be great if we had a way to be just sort of not listening to the content of people's voices, but just listening to the overall tonality and trends and tone of people and groups working together. And if it was kind of trending up where stress is rising, it's gonna harm your performance. You're gonna start making mistakes. So if you're like in a healthcare setting and you're making mistakes, and maybe you make a mistake because you stop watching a patient and they fall, or you make a mistake in a medication, giving a medication or something. Those are, critical design things. Or if you're trading stocks and you make a mistake because you were too stressed out, could be anything, or just more trivial examples. The idea here is to have real-time monitoring of overall stress and being able to ping somebody on the phone and say, hey, take a second, take 15 seconds, pause, regroup. You're getting too stressed out. It's damage. It's not a good thing. Or some kind of cue, or connect back into the environmental control system and do something to modify the lighting. Like Charlie was saying, maybe the lighting was getting too dim, or who knows. But that's kind of the concept. So that's something we're working on. And in fact, I've got the algorithm written and we have it encoded and we have it in a test sensor right now. So we're going to be starting to train that through machine learning. So it's just kind of a drill down on one thing that we're trying to do to actually mitigate stress through technology, perhaps at work.
Thank you, Mike. That is interesting. Kind of scared me a little bit because as Italian, I'm very passionate when I talk. I would hate that they tell that I'm stressed, but I'm just Italian.
Right. We'll have to have a special a special code just for Italians, probably. No.
Maybe that is actually it was a joke, but really it's interesting. Yeah. So
thank you.
Before moving with my question that I had for you, I want to jump into one that I received in the Q and answer box. So this from Lorenzo Melle, who's interested to learn about changes in team building approaches and tactics that may emerge post-pandemic. Would you like me to reframe, or is it clear? I guess the question is if post-pandemic and the pandemic itself, and therefore the new post-pandemic world is going to change and shift the way we create and build teamwork. What's your opinion about that? Whoever wants to answer here can jump in.
Well, it's certainly going to change two major factors. It's going to change the way we approach work, hybrid form, but it's also fundamentally changes every organization's culture. And that may not be something people are thinking about, because if you think of culture as the kind of the tacit agreements, the way people decide to get work done, what we value is going to change. What's going to be important to us is going to change. And space is a key encoder of those behaviors that we value and the behaviors we want to shift. So if your company used to have a value around, we do our best work in the office and we expect you to come here. So how do you redesign a facility that shows that this is a two-way street now? We're having a different conversation with our employees and we're trying to express new values. The whole work process is changing too. I got to take a trip last week. Actually, a physical trip with physical people in a physical space. And we had a very engaging conversation that, quite frankly, we could not have done looking at little boxes on a screen. So again, rethinking what we're doing, what we're trying to do, it's a fundamental redesign. We've never been there. We don't know what we don't know, but we need to be engaged in these conversations and use it as a stakeholder conversation between the people that are going to be experiencing this versus kind of the experts come in and we tell you what to do.
Thank you, Rex.
Can I tag on to that for a second?
For sure.
Exactly what everybody's saying. I would like to point out that what we're not talking about is that managers and leaders in this post-COVID world where PTSD is more prevalent than not, they're going to require a new set of skills about how to work and be effective in these new environments. And probably topmost on that, I would say, is increased emotional intelligence and empathy. So we're going to have to figure out a way to help leaders learn to be more empathetic and practice such things as active listening. So it's not just for the worker bees. It's the folks that are leading are going to need to develop some new skills also.
You know, Charlie, that's a great point. And I would just tag on to that to say that traditionally, especially at the senior leadership level, empathy is not typically ever been a constructive leadership aspect. In fact, it's like you can't have too much. Exactly. That was always conventional wisdom, right? Yeah, so that's a huge change.
Well, and to tag on again, Gallup has some numbers that about 18% of managers are naturally inclined towards what you might call developmental leadership versus task-driven leadership. And the research is very clear that as you go up the ladder, the competitive nature of going up the ladder also begins to shut down your mirror neuron. The mirror neuron is your ability to sense and feel what someone else is experiencing. And of course, if you've got to fire your neighbor that you've carpooled with for 6 months, you know, you begin to have to detach yourself from how you feel about the decisions you make, which then detaches yourself from the people you're making the decisions about. And that's just a factor of going up the ladder that we need to reconnect to in a different way. And part of that is being visible and accessible as leaders.
Yep.
And these are just basic new skills that Charlie is talking about that we have to retrain ourselves around.
I have a question for all of you, building on top of what you just said and talk about. I mean, if it is my understanding, we will need a way more empathetic work environment because of this post-PTSD experiences that is going to affect 90 million people, which is a huge number. So I was wondering if you have any idea of how the workplace should be designed in order to kind of advocate for more empathy between people and between hierarchies. Is there a space that can be designed that actually can facilitate that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead, Rex.
Well, and two things. One of the clients we've worked with, Dr. Mike and I have worked with, took an approach that hospitality takes. It's called client journey. So they do something where they do a day in the life of typical employees, so they understand what the experience of commuting is like. They look at the touch points throughout the space, the parking lot, checking in, the coffee area. Is it a stress point, neutral point, an engagement point? And then we've been using what's called activity workplace design for a long time that gives people a choice of where they want to work. So it's work areas based on the kind of work being done, based different than just everybody in accounting goes here and everybody in sales goes over there. So yeah, we've been doing these things for a while. Hospitality has been doing it for a long time, especially if you get to go to one of the better hotels like a Four Seasons or Ritz. They have emotional intelligence. I saw a facilities group trained in being able to acknowledge someone, eye-to-eye contact at 10 feet, give them a verbal response at 5 feet, read their body language and see if they need help or not. Now, these are frontline facility support people, food services people, maintenance people that were trained in the additional skill because they're visible in the facility on how to be responsive to people's needs and read those. So all that training is around for us.
Thank you, Rex. I think Charlie
Yeah,
wanted to say something.
To follow on to that, if I had to give somebody one single design principle, I'd say the workspaces going forward have got to look more like a club and less like a factory floor. And that's a very general statement, but you can kind of get the idea what Rex was talking about is, those welcoming areas instead of, a robotic line by line, everybody in a slot kind of thing. So I think that we've got a lot to learn from the hospitality industry, and maybe we need to get some of those folks involved in our design teams. There's certainly a few of them out there that are looking for work right now.
I would add on to what both Charlie and Rex have been talking about. I think if I had to offer one thing, I would say it's this idea of inclusive design or legible design that so that people have a shared work experience. And so if you have a shared work experience, in terms of the way you're interacting with the space and you all understand how it works, maybe that could help to build empathy as well, because it would be a point of connection.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Just to, keep going, is there, compared to the typical office work environment, this is a question for Charlie, and it's really, to follow up what we were talking about, empathy. But compared to the typical office work environment, what are the unique aspects of a work at home workplace for people on the PTSD spectrum? But I also would add the work environment for these people going back to work. So both the scenarios, I think.
Well, I think the key for work at home environments, and I've talked about this for a long time, but it's especially critical now, even with PTSD, is individualizing and customizing that environment so people are comfortable in it. And we really haven't done a lot like that. It's like, okay, here's your login and your password and your laptop, and go home and go to work. And we expect you to be on a Zoom at 8 in the morning. We're going to need a lot more individualistic design help, if you will, for these people. And I'm working with an interior designer right now that we're trying to create a kind of like a workbook, a package to give people to do that. It's like, okay, be careful. You may not want to put your display of military medals in your direct line of sight in your workplace, because that's probably going to be a trigger for you. And, folks probably didn't even think about that. So it's little things like that. But again, echoing what everybody else is saying, is giving people an opportunity to actively participate in the design process is critical. Recognizing some of the limitations they may have, accommodations that they need, and perhaps they're not even cognizant of some of these accommodations that would be helpful to them. So it starts to come down to individual work with facilities folks to help people consciously structure their work at home environment. It's not just the kitchen table or the spare bedroom. You look at Rex's background, he's done a wonderful job of structuring his own, but we all need to do that. That's my point.
Right.
Thank you, Charlie. Another question that is for Rex, and then I will have one last one for everybody. But for you, Rex, I wish to learn a little bit more about post-traumatic growth and what that is and what it represents.
Yeah, so post-traumatic growth was a word phrase to explain and look at what was different about the small percentages of soldiers that came back more resilient from the experience, the same traumatic experiences than most. So when they started looking at it, they found Dr. Seligman's work found 5 traits. So you can look up his work in the book Flourish. And Dr. Seligman was once the president of the American Psychological Association. We've added the whole physical health side to the equation that isn't in that as well. So sleep, proper diet, movement. So we've added a 6th element to that just because of the people that we're seeing in coaching. So it's well documented. You can look up the word post-traumatic growth. It's actually a description of the ability to become more resilient through stress and strain, through the challenges, through hardships, through traumatic experiences. But it takes that ecosystem, those 6 elements, to have that resiliency.
Thank you, Rex. So we have just a few minutes left, literally just 3. So I want to say goodbye to everyone that participated and thank you them. And I hope you enjoyed this webinar as much as I did. And I would just want to leave with this last question for every and each of you. What do you think is the biggest challenge for this next year? As Mike said earlier, I think the US is going to see the light at the end of the tunnel. I hope it's going to happen in each country around the world. So people are getting back to work. We are slowly getting back to normal. Let's call it normal. What's the biggest challenge in doing that?
Managing change.
You can start.
Managing change.
Managing change.
I think my colleagues have, kind of been touching on that. Change is difficult. Change is a hard thing to deal with, and we've been through a lot of it. And we're going to be going back to a workplace that won't look like it was, and people will need to manage differently and so forth. And I think it's a huge change management project, global.
I totally agree, Mike. And for me, the biggest challenge is disabusing people of the notion that we're going to go back to the way it used to be prior to 2019. That's not happening. And we just need to get on with it and not expect it's going to go back to the way it used to be.
And I would just close. It's really the human side. Our industry is focused on the logistical side of bringing people back to work. Very important. But it's the human thing, and it's the psychological ripple effect that we've not yet even begun to see that we need to prepare for. And we need to redesign our companies to accommodate a new norm and a new expectation in the workplace.
So can we say then that resilience, in that sense, it's really not about bouncing back, but adapting to the new condition?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. Well, unless you have something more to say, let me stop sharing. And we reached the end of our webinar, and I really, really thank you, Emily Dunn, to contribute to the organization of this webinar, Renee Mantut, that was present here and helping out, and of course, Rex Miller, Dr. Mike O'Neill, and Dr. Charlie Grantham. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yep.
It's great.
Mm-hmm. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay.
So yeah, it went
Are
well.
we sticking on?